Today is Sunday, May 31st, 2026, and today is National Smile Day, which is one of those strangely complicated human behaviors that looks simple until you actually think about it for more than 10 seconds. People smile when they're happy. People smile when they're nervous. People smile during awkward silences. Customer service workers smile through emotional exhaustion every single day. And somehow humanity collectively agreed, yes, let's dedicate a holiday to this, which honestly fits today's episode surprisingly well, because May 31st kept circling back to ordinary things becoming emotionally permanent. Clocks, breakfast, shipwrecks, cultural icons. The quiet systems humans slowly built into everyday life until they became part of the background architecture of existence itself. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and a person who keeps discovering that history is somehow both fascinating and deeply concerning at the same time. On May 31st, 1859, the clock tower housing Big Ben officially began keeping time in London. And one thing I kept thinking about while reading through this story is how strange public clocks must have felt before people fully adjusted to them. Because today, most people carry clocks in their pockets, on their wrists, on appliances, inside cars. Modern humans are surrounded by time constantly. But in the mid-1800s, large public clocks still carried symbolic weight. They represented coordination, structure, shared reality. And Big Ben especially became something larger than a clock almost immediately. Partly because of scale. The tower dominated the skyline. The bells were enormous. The sound traveled across London. But also because industrial society increasingly depended on synchronized time. Factories needed schedules. Railroads needed precision. Governments needed coordination. And suddenly, public timekeeping stopped being abstract and became infrastructure. Which is fascinating because time itself hadn't changed. Human beings changed. The way societies organized daily life became more rigid, more synchronized, more measured. And Big Ben quietly became part of that transformation. There's also something strangely comforting about large public clocks, even now. People photograph them constantly. Movies use them immediately to establish atmosphere. Entire cities emotionally identify with them. And maybe that's because clocks represent consistency. The feeling that something is still running predictably in the background, even when everything else changes. And speaking of systems becoming embedded into our ordinary daily life, May 31st also gave us one of the strangest examples imaginable of humans industrializing breakfast. On May 31st, 1884, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg patented techniques connected to the development of cornflakes. And honestly, the deeper you go into cereal history, the stranger it becomes. Because cereal wasn't originally invented as fun food. It was invented partly as a health philosophy. Kellogg was deeply interested in diet, digestion, routine, discipline, and bodily health. And many of his beliefs reflected the extremely specific wellness culture of the late 1800s, which included sanitariums, controlled diets, exercise routines, and some genuinely unusual medical ideas. But one thing that fascinates me most about Kellogg is how intensely he believed bland foods could help create morally disciplined people, which feels both deeply sincere and incredibly funny from a modern perspective. Imagine inventing breakfast cereal because you think excitement is dangerous. And yet somehow cornflakes survived all the philosophy surrounding them. That's the remarkable part. Most people eating cereal today aren't participating in a 19th century health reform movement. They're just trying to function at 7:12 in the morning. But over time, cereal became one of the defining symbols of modern routine. Quick breakfasts, mass production, advertising mascots, kitchen tables, morning schedules. And what started as a highly specific wellness philosophy eventually transformed into a global everyday product, which history does surprisingly often. Humans create systems for one reason, and later, generations inherit the routine without the original explanation attached anymore. And then sometimes something disappears long enough that it stops feeling historical and starts feeling almost mythical, until suddenly people find it again. On May 31st, 1985, the discovery of the Titanic wreck was formally announced publicly, and almost immediately, worldwide fascination reignited. Because for over 70 years, the Titanic existed in this strange emotional category, somewhere between history and legend. People knew roughly where it sank, but the actual ship itself remained missing beneath the Atlantic Ocean, hidden nearly 2.5 miles underwater. And honestly, I think humans become emotionally obsessed with lost things partly because absence creates imagination. People pictured the wreck differently for decades. Some imagined it preserved perfectly. Others imagined complete destruction. Then in 1985, deep-sea exploration technology finally located it. And one detail I couldn't stop thinking about while reading reactions from the time was how quiet the footage felt. Not dramatic, not explosive, just dark ocean water, slowly revealing railings, shapes, and outlines emerging from blackness. And somehow that made the disaster feel emotionally real again. The Titanic stopped being purely symbolic. It became physical. A real object sitting silently at the bottom of the ocean for generations, while the world above it completely changed. And I think that's part of why the discovery affected people so strongly. It reminded them that history isn't gone. A lot of it is still physically sitting somewhere, waiting to be rediscovered. And after spending today's episode thinking about routines, familiar symbols, and the things humans quietly build into everyday cultural life, it actually feels fitting to end with someone whose screen presence became part of that same background familiarity for generations of audiences. Born on May 31st, 1930, in San Francisco, California, Clint Eastwood became one of those rare performers who eventually stopped feeling like a celebrity and started feeling almost culturally permanent. And what's interesting is how much of that came from restraint. Eastwood rarely needed long speeches. His performances often relied on silence, pauses, expressions, stillness. Whether in westerns, detective films, or later directing projects, he built characters who always seemed to be thinking slightly more than they were saying out loud. And audiences leaned toward that quietness, especially during periods where entertainment often became louder, faster, and more exaggerated. What stood out to me reading about his career was how carefully he evolved instead of constantly reinventing himself dramatically. Actor, director, producer, composer. Over time, his films increasingly became reflections on aging, violence, heroism, and American mythology itself. And somehow his screen presence stayed recognizable across generations without feeling entirely frozen in one era, which honestly is harder to do than it looks. Something I kept circling back to while working through May 31st was how many parts of ordinary life are actually constructed systems humans slowly agreed to trust together. Public timekeeping, breakfast routines, shared historical memory, cultural icons. And once those systems become familiar enough, people stop noticing how strange they really are. A giant clock helping organize millions of lives. Mass-produced cereal becoming emotionally associated with childhood mornings. A shipwreck sitting silently in darkness while generations mythologize it above the surface. Humans are incredibly good at turning unusual things into normal routines. Maybe that's one of our defining skills as a species. Anyway, that's where today's stories eventually settled. And before we open another page tomorrow, here's today's beautifully strange quote. We are all time travelers, moving at the speed of exactly 60 minutes per hour. Spider Robinson. If you'd like to hear more of my work or see other corners of the internet I've been quietly building things in, you can head over to waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns. Thanks for hanging out with me for a few minutes. I'll see you tomorrow.